Hello, bros. We're back with A Mother in History. Marguerite Oswald, the mother of the man who killed Kennedy by Jean Stafford. Move on to section 3. Internal thunderclap shocked me awake on Mother's Day, and the rain on my windows sounded like kettle drums being belted by a gang of lunatics. A dolorous gloaming hung in my air-conditioned room, where the temperature was always that of a meat cooler. The windows, of course, could not be opened, so that even on a warm day I had goose flesh if I took off my sweater. And the rushing wetness outside was a palpable ectoplasm within. My impulse was to eliminate the day by taking a sleeping pill, but I was committed. I must go with Mrs. Oswald to her son's grave. For a long time I lay abed, dawdling over a great pot of coffee, and the Dallas News, pitching and tossing through the dispatches from South Vietnam and the Dominican Republic. I had the dislocating feeling that I was not reading about the culmination of crises today that would be annulled by, by different ones tomorrow. But that I was trying to get into my head the complicated background and causes of a fait accompli for a history examination. The living, current, and inexplicable chaos was not happening plangently in South Asia or in the West Indies. It was not political upheaval and war. It was the assassination of President Kennedy that had taken place only hours or even minutes ago. Probably the storm through which we drove to Fort Worth was not the very worst I had ever seen. But at the time I could not recall another to equal its infuriated lightning and its dooming detonations and the Niagaras that roared down on us from 4 directions. Baffling the windshields, it sounded like catastrophe, and I was sorry to be an alien corn. But by the time we got to Mrs. Oswald Street, the fulminations began to peter out, and the malevolent splendor was replaced by a sniffling nastiness, the kind of mess that causes angleworms to materialize, mauve and visceral, on sidewalks. I mean, this lady is a tryhard. My God. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a voice, much amplified, was blaring. I thought at first it was coming from the sound truck of a political candidate on a mobile stump or from one advertising an American Legion carnival, but as I got out of the car, I realized that it was pouring out of Mrs. Oswald's house and that the voice belonged to her. I knocked, unheard, several times. The tulips I saw had been decapitated by the wind, and their stems were limp among the stiff spears of the everlasting humbug, Heather. What an injustice to a mother, shouted Mrs. Oswald's disembodied voice. If this was true, the facts couldn't hurt me so deeply, or I would say, consider the source. But this quote, along with many others, has gone all over the world, and I have been attacked publicly as a mother by television commentators. They said I was going from place to place speaking in behalf of my son. Was it because I wanted to vindicate myself as a mother? What an awful thing. I have taken this with all the composure I know how, but inwardly I have seethed. The door was open, but the screen was latched. The tape recorders were on the floor where we had left them yesterday, and I could see the discs of both revolving as they released 180 words a minute. I knocked again, more loudly, and called out. In a moment, Mrs. Oswald appeared. I had interrupted her in the middle of her lunch, and she continued to chew through her welcoming smile as she opened the screen. She was behindhand. Behindhand? She explained because she thought I might be delayed by the storm. She herself thought nothing of those funny old Texas storms and loved driving through them, but she didn't know how people from Massachusetts took to wild West weather. As I have said, I had come down from Connecticut, and she had my address there, but this kind of minutia did not concern her. From time to time, she had advised me to look something up in the Warren report, and she would preface this by saying alternately, "When you get back to New York or when you get back to Boston," once experimentally I said that I would soon have to return to my post at Austin, and this news had no effect at all. I made out her observations about the comical old Wild West storms largely by reading her lips, since her recorded voice drowned out her current one. She let me in and turned the volume down and invited me to join her in a snack. I thanked her and refused, and I asked if I might put my soaked umbrella in the bathroom. The living room was even more disordered than it had been when I left it. Oh man. I left it the day before. The coffee table was piled high with newspaper clippings and pamphlets and Xeroxed documents. The lids of the tape recorders lay on the floor, and their canvas covers were waddled up as if someone had meant to throw them out but hadn't got around to it. Evidently, Mrs. Oswald had been so busy in my absence that she had let her nest go hang. The bedroom, however, was as neat as if no one had ever slept or dressed in it, and in the aesthetic antiseptic bathroom, besides the towels imprinted with unlikely anemones, the only things I saw were a bottle of hand lotion named To a Wild Rose and an ornamental bar of soap embossed with sharp golden lilies. If Mrs. Oswald suffered from dyspepsia or conjunctivitis, she did not tell the world about it by leaving her medicaments on view. In the living room, the affirmative voice went on. I understood that Mr. William Manchester was commissioned by the Kennedy family to rewrite the events of the 3 days, and his book will be out on November 22nd, 1968. Mr. Manchester is the author of Profiles in Courage. She had told me this earlier, and when I had diffidently suggested that perhaps she had the title confused with Manchester's book called Portrait of a President, she indicated that the confusion resided in my addle pate. Today, she went on record. I would like to say now, unless Mr. William Manchester discusses my life and my son's life personally with me, this book will also be inaccurate. He came to see me, but he was here no more than 10 or 15 minutes. However, there was one very important question he asked, and I will tell you the question. He asked me what a certain party looked like, and did I have a picture of this certain party. I didn't ask any questions, and he just stayed about 10 minutes in my home. I say he will make the same mistakes as the commission members, unless he cooperates with me about my life and my son's life. This is why there's so many distortions in the Warren report. They spoke to outsiders and they questioned my boys about age 6 and 7 that couldn't remember things, and they didn't have the courtesy to come to me and verify these facts. They printed whatever they were told, and so I state here and now to the American people that if Mr. Manchester does not spend at least 4 days with me, the Kennedy book will also be inaccurate. Because I feel like Mrs. Marguerite Oswald, is the only one that can rectify some of the inaccuracies. I am the mother of this boy. The other two boys were in the service. They don't know about a lot of our life, and it has to come from me. Many of the readers are wondering, well, why doesn't Mrs. Oswald put all of this into one book so that we can get some of the true story? It is impossible, dear reader. To begin with, this book would have to be researched for about a year or so, and no one has come to my aid, no publisher with the money or a writer to do this type work. So until that time and money are afforded me, I will do the best I can. I will admit it is not enough, but as a mother, I am doing the best I can. I looked at myself in the mirror over the wash basin and stuck out my tongue and then went back to the living room. Mrs. Oswald was at her dining table, proceeding with her plentiful lunch. She got up and shut off the machines, and she explained, I'll start this over from the beginning for you. You see, when I got up this morning, I thought I'd just print something on the tape all on my own. We can erase it if you don't like it. but I really and truly think I have some good instances here for you. I've got some real dynamite and some real exclusives. I was not pleased by any means. I had brought no other tapes, and there were several questions I wanted to ask her, but erasing all that yardage scared me because I was sure we would botch it and there would be nothing left. So I managed an accepting smile and sat down, prepared to listen. Can you do more than one thing at a time? She asked. I mean, can you listen and read and so on and so forth all at once? I can. I can cook and look at TV and clean house and this and that. Busy, busy, busy. Some of the reporters wrote me up as the unsinkable Mrs. Oswald. The unsinkable Mrs. Oswald. Because if you can, I want you to look at these scrapbooks and some other things. I'll just go on and finish my dinner. In point of fact, I cannot easily assign my attention to two foci simultaneously. Foci? And it sets my teeth on edge to hear Scarlatti on a phonograph while cocktail conversation is going on. I can be seduced to attitudes I despise of a symphony if a symphony is the background to a discussion of zoning laws. But Mrs. Oswald sat me down before a pile of albums and then went to fool with the tape recorders and recited excerpts of her litany to the American way of life. And I had no choice but to divide myself into several receptacles. There were 4 big green albums of newspaper clippings, one devoted to Lee, one to Marina, one to Ruby, and one to herself. They were kept meticulously, each clipping adhered to the page in precise relation to the edges, and all were protected by jackets of thick cellophane. Once I was arrested by surprise and a fleeting pity. In the album about herself, the headlines read, Mrs. Oswald continues talkathon in Washington. Mother of Kennedy assassin arrives here to talk. I found a small pressed flower, a cluster of trailing arbutus, perhaps, or a star of Bethlehem. Nothing in the memory books was news to me, and so, although I dutifully turned the pages, I was not reading but listening to Mrs. Oswald's Mother's Day epistle. It began serenely. Upon waking up this morning, and it being Mother's Day, I've decided that in defense of myself and my son, Lee Harvey Oswald, I would put a little something on the tape. I sincerely hope that you will find it newsworthy and print it. Here again, I know you want just a casual interview, and you want to keep away from the Warren Commission report, but because it is involved in my personal life and that of my son, I will have to go back to it from time to time. Now they talked about me working as an insurance lady. Here on page 378 of the Warren Commission report, they say she would sometimes take Lee with her, apparently leaving him alone in the car while she transacted her business. Once she worked during the school year. Lee had to leave an empty house in the morning and return to it for lunch and again at night, his mother having trained him to do that rather than to play with other children. What an injustice. Anybody who ever sold insurance, and there are many, many insurance men that are going to read this and listen to me and know a person like I was selling insurance and didn't want to make a killing. We could go out in 1 hour's time and collect $30. And so I was home most of the time with my boy Lee. I was usually with him unless I had a definite appointment. I always tried to make my appointments later on when both the man and the woman were at home, because I found in the beginning when I started to sell and I talked to the woman, I was asked to come back to discuss it with the husband. Well, then I would be immediately rejected at the door, and the simple reason for that was that the wife had discussed what I said with the husband, and of course she didn't know as much about it as I did, and she didn't present a good case. So I would have definite appointments instead, and usually Out of the 4 or 5 calls, I would sell something. Now, about did he play with other children? When Lee was 11 years old, he visited my sister in New Orleans, New Louisiana, which is 525 miles from Fort Worth. I put him on a train, and alone he went. I did caution him to be very careful and not go with strangers or talk with any men who might want to make his acquaintance. And there again, I am proud that I thought about these things. This is motherhood, yet I was criticized. In the Warren report, my sister told the story that I told Lee not to talk to anyone, and it was taken up quite a bit. I think about a page long, that this is what I taught Lee in life, to be by himself. No, this is not the case at all. This was a particular instance. And I also told him when he went to school not to go in a car with a stranger. And isn't this what we teach our children? In defense of motherhood, also, Lee stayed at my sister's house for 2 weeks, and that was the arrangement. My sister remarks in her testimony that while he was there, he refused to play with any other children. She went into great detail that they tried to get him out of the house and play with the children. Let's understand things a little bit. Here was a perfect stranger, a visitor. He hadn't lived in New Orleans since he was 5 years old. Now he's 11, and he knew no one in the neighborhood. How do you get an 11-year-old boy? Wait. A girl. How do you get an 11-year-old boy, a girl who in this day and age is almost at maturity? The hell does that mean? I have to smile because the whole thing is so ridiculous. Let me read that again. As I said, I'm trying not to crack this spine. How do you get an 11-year-old boy, a girl? Oh, I see. How do you get an 11-year-old boy, a girl who in this day and age is almost at maturity? Still don't get what that means. I have to smile because the whole thing is so ridiculous. I glanced over at the diner, who smiled in confirmation, and I believe I smiled too. Did she bring any 11 or 12-year-olds into the home for Lee to meet? And did he refuse to meet them and go off and play with them? That would be different. But no, she didn't like him in the house listening to television or reading comic books. She wanted him to go out and play with other children. What other children were there for Lee to play with? So again, let's have defense of Lee Harvey Oswald. Another thing I objected to in my sister's testimony, when Mr. Jenner asked if any of her boys sold newspapers, and she said, oh yes, her son Gene did, and she wanted them to know that he saved his money and bought war bonds with it. Well, this is a remarkable and admirable thing for a boy to do, and Mr. Jenner asked if she ever knew that Lee sold papers, and she said no, and there were other people. Question about that. There again, I go in defense of my son. Lee traveled with me and Mr. Ekdahl, and when he did go to school, he was at an age where he couldn't even be hired to sell newspapers. The boys in the newspaper business were 15 and 16 years old, which is the trend today. My own newspaper boy is about 17 years old, and these boys are working their way through college. Now we're talking about a young boy, because this was before age 13, before the New York episode. But you see, I'm proud of my sister's boys. I think she has a nice family. But let's go a little deeper into an understanding. She remarked very proudly that her boy bought war bonds. Her boy had a father who was in the bookmaking business and had a very large income. They owned their own home. He was very liberal with his money, and even though Gene did have a newspaper route, he did not contribute to the household. As a matter of fact, his father gave him lunch money besides. So you see, this is the difference. Let's face it. This is where the human element comes in. This is where I have been persecuted. I have shed many a tear. My brains were scrambled eggs. I was reminded as I tossed in the sponge and gave up trying to proceed from A to B to C. of one of those games in which you were meant to direct a blob of mercury by clever twist of the wrist through a maze so that it fetches up all of a piece in a central zone. Sometimes the blob sprawls out like an amoeba, and at other times it multiplies itself by 20, so that there are tiny beads all over the place. Sometimes the integer remains but takes a wayward route and lodges far from the goal. Such a plaything, soi-disant, can lead to temper tantrums in the middle-aged. I could get no foothold in Mrs. Oswald's reminiscences, and yet, while my mind roved aimlessly every which way, it remained here in this room, and on this day. I tried, during the sporadic bursts of thunder and short-lived violent spates, to transport myself to a ship my husband and I had once taken from the Piraeus to New York in November, when the seas were the kind that had wrecked the Hesperus, but I couldn't pay heed to the memory. Usually, when I am totally bewildered, this happens to me often at the opera, and 92% of the time, when I am listening to a learned paper or a political speech. I can get my bearings by reciting the names of the states or by declining a stark manlic noun. I use der Stall, and then a schwach weiblich one, die Frau, and a gemisch sachlich. Das Ohr is as good as a castrato as any. But today I couldn't sum it up more than a score of states and German declensions were quite out of the question. So I went back to following the leader of my great leaden clodhoppers. And there are the things I have the ability of noticing. Why? Because it's affecting me personally, and I'm this type person. Lee was this type person. He had wisdom. He finished his high school education in the Marines, and I wouldn't say he was an uneducated man, knowing Russian like he did, and a little Spanish and German, just a young boy. You know, Russian's a very hard language, but a formal education he did not have. He had the know-how. I myself don't have a high school education, and I know I speak very bad English, but a $10,000 a year engineering man begged me to marry him. I made him wait a year, and he was a Harvard man. I've been on television with the highest caliber of people and held my own, so I don't think I do so bad in that department. I'm uneducated, but very versatile. I think it's a natural thing. It isn't anything that I've studied or learned. It's just doing things that come naturally. As the phrase goes, and Lee had it. Believe me, Lee Harvey Oswald had this natural wisdom. Some people with a formal education are so dull that really and truly I find them stupid. All they know is what's in the books, and that's that. I gave up counting on the disclosure of the exclusives she had hinted that the dynamite did not go off. I really hate this book, honestly. And that's about halfway through this long section, so I'm going to stop. All right. Not only do I hate this book, I hate that I can't lay it flat. And I have to hold it like I'm fucking paralyzed in some way. But I don't want to break the spine. Plus, I'm tired. Long week. Blah, blah, blah. Boo-hoo. Goodbye.